thumbs up already.
Okay. We're live. Then. So welcome back. This is the last session of this afternoon, the Saturday of the May gathering, the annual gathering of the KFA 2020. I'm sitting here with Mark Lee and Gianni Carubo. Mark is going to do a presentation on his latest book. It's called The World Teacher. And just a little introduction of Mark, although Mark doesn't need much introduction because most people know him, but he was the executive director of the Krishnamoorthy Foundation for 20 years. He was the main editor for the collected works when it was published originally. And he's now still on the board of the Krishnamurti Foundation of America, and he is also still on the board of the Oak Grove School, which is the school of the Krishnamurti Foundation. I think that sums it up, Mark.
And India.
And And Mark is a trustee of the Krishnamurti Foundation of India, and he worked at the Rishi Valley School for several years. Good.
Thank you, Jaap. It's very, very nice to be here on a beautiful spring day. It's a little weird doing a virtual gathering and not having smiling friends and faces in front of us, but there are a few in the room today. So for me this is a different kind of technology, but I hope it works. I hope it works for all of you who are watching. I'd like to talk today about two books that I have recently completed. As you know, this is the 125th anniversary of Krishnamoorthy's birth, from May of 2019 to May of 2020. And there have been observances around the world. In the Indian Foundation, they released several books. Similarly, the American Foundation. And so I'd like to talk to you about two books that I've done recently. But to give a preface or a preamble to this, I would like to raise two seeming paradoxes, which I have been very mindful of throughout my life, working with the teachings and in the foundation. And these paradoxes I have grappled with and I've kept in mind as I've worked on these two books. So I thought I'd just share them with you to begin with. Krishnamurti said throughout his life that he, as a teacher, was unimportant, that he did not matter in the whole process of the delivery of the teachings. He said he had no personality, he said he had no character, and that he was totally vacant. He actually said as well, the speaker is anonymous. He has no authority. He as a person does not exist. We are both observing together what is happening, so please don't pay any attention or give any importance to the personality of the speaker. Krishnamoorthy was always, from the beginning, very clear that who he was not important. His history, his credentials, his voice of the teachings was what was important. In the early days when books were published, he even went so far as to insist that there not be any photographs of him on the book covers. And this changed in later life. When first photographs were used, he said they must be serious and not show him smiling. So he was conscious of the impact of the visual, of his image on a book. Then he talked later in life, in the 70s, about the importance of the public knowing who he was. And he said that there will be, in the time after his passing, there will be a challenge to convey who the teacher was, who was Krishnamurti. So the self-abnegation of the early years changed slightly. The second paradox is that Kay said that the teachings are not in the books. The teachings are not on film. They're not on tape. That his words, his descriptive words, were not the teachings. The word is not the thing. So, that creates a quandary when you think that there are 100 million words in Krishnamurti, and he says that the teachings are not in those 100 million words. So, where are those teachings? Well, he described them as they're in direct perception, immediate awareness, attention. That's where the teachings were. And if you study the teachings, you are struck by the fact that in Kay's talks and in his writings, he conveyed his message without the usual devices that authors and speakers use, metaphor, jokes, stories, illustrations. That all of these are missing. Anecdotes, they're all missing from the teachings. So the teachings are conveyed in very sparse language that immediately draws you in. But then, again, if the teachings are not on the page, not on the film, where are they? And he said repeatedly, in looking, in listening, in observing, in direct perception, you find the teachings. So, there are two, let's get into the two books that I wanted to describe to you. The first book was a commission by the Krishnamurti Foundation, India, for this 125th birth anniversary. Foundation asked that if I could do a new biography for new generations of people who were not familiar with Krishnamurti. And they described this generation as being 18 to 30 and not at all interested in classic literature, not interested in the Upanishads or the Gita or the Mahabharata. So they're unfamiliar with their own literary, spiritual legacies. And that this younger generation have short attention spans. Well, when I was first asked, I said, I don't think I'm the right person to do this book. First of all, I'm not in India. I'm not an Indian. And I think you need a younger person. So the publisher said, on the contrary, that these qualities of this generation are not just describing Indian youth, but they could describe the youth of the world. And on reflection, you could see that that was quite true. American youth, European youth, youth everywhere, are different from at least my generation, in my youth. So I agreed to do the book. The book, which is called World Teacher, and you can see the cover, was to be a short book. They said that young people don't like thick, heavy books. They don't like scholarly books. They don't read detail. So make it a book that is a quick read. I spent the whole of last year, 2019, working on this book. I had the good fortune of being able to sit here in Pine Cottage at Krishnamoorthy's desk in the early mornings, peaceful and quiet, surrounded by Krishnamoorthy's library, his personal library, and then also the foundation library here, which has thousands of Krishnamurti books in English and multiple languages. So I had a good source for reference. One of the first things I needed to do was to come up with a title, because titles are important. Titles help focus and direct the emphasis in a book. In my research, I discovered that in the late 70s, Krishnamurti, who was involved at that time in some court cases, lawsuits, gave a deposition to an attorney. And in that deposition, the attorney asked Krishnamurti, "Sir, are you the world teacher?" And Krishnamurti's answer was quite remarkable. He said, "If you mean, am I the world teacher according to what Annie Besant and Leadbeater and the Theosophical Society said I was, I am not. But if you consider that I have traveled around the world my whole life and spoken for more than 60 years, then I am." Well, on reading that, it gave me the nerve to title the book World Teacher. Now this was a break from tradition because we foundations over the decades have never referred to him as the world teacher. It didn't appear as a book title, it didn't appear in the literature, but I took the license to use his remarkable reply in front of an attorney as enough evidence that he thought of himself as world teacher. So that gave me the title. So I kept the audience in mind, and I kept the paradoxes that I've described to you in mind as I went through the process of writing the book. It turned out to be more of an exercise in what not to write, because the volume of Kay's work, the extraordinary scope and dimension of his personal life was quite extraordinary. And if you read the other biographies of Krishnamoorthy by Mary Lutyens and Pupal Jayakar, you see the enormous detail that they provide. Again, knowing that young people are not going to be so interested in the minutiae of his life, I had to take out a lot of the detail that is in other biographies. But I found that if I was going to engage the reader quickly, I had to organize the book differently than most biographies. And instead of doing a linear progression, birth to death, simply describing one event or one aspect of his teaching life after another, I decided to organize it differently. Instead, I divided the book up into subject chapters. So, chapter on Krishnamurti on authority. And when writing about authority, it brought up his foundations and his relationship with the authority of his own words, the authority of his teachings, now and in the future. And education naturally led into something about the schools that he founded, but the schools, not only his schools, but education in a larger sense. The learning process. Then, because Krishnamurti talked so much in his life about relationships, I did 1 or 2 chapters on his relationships with men and with women. And I was able to go into related issues, marriage and sex, and subjects that I thought would be of interest to the young reader. And then the final chapter having to do with Krishnamurti's passing, his death, naturally required that I raise issues that would be of interest to Indian youth, which would be reincarnation and karma. So I included that as well. I found that through all this research that there was very little attention paid in Krishnamurti's other biographies to the impact of California, of America, on Krishnamurti's life. And I sincerely felt that this influence, California particularly, was quite underplayed, not stressed, not gone into in any depth at all. So I did 1 or 2 chapters just on that. When you realize that as Krishnamurti was being groomed to be the world teacher, and he was to have a worldwide audience. Much of it was to be in California, because the society were going to build temples. They found huge fields of Carrara quality marble in central California that they were going to quarry and use to build temples. They raised hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to buy Baja California. And that was going to be the seat of the new race that Krishnamoorthy was to lead. So there is quite a bit in the book about Krishnamoorthy's relationship to California, the people here, and the landscape. California changed his whole way of living. Instead of talking and being friends with and spending time with the religious, intellectual people of India and Europe that he was so used to for the first many years of his life, here he became friendly with farmers, with ranchers, with ordinary people in the Ojai Valley, people he met in Hollywood, poets, authors. This changed his perspective because he was relating to a very different group of people in California and the United States. When the book was finished and was released, the publisher and the Indian Foundation invited me to come and to go on a book tour of India. So in January, my wife Asha and I went to India, and we traveled from Bangalore to Chennai, Chennai to Calcutta, Calcutta to Benares, Benares to Delhi, Delhi back to Bangalore. And all along the way, I presented the book, signed copies, gave small talks, and had a great deal of fun offering the book to the Indian public. When we left Calcutta, the Times of India had a literary supplement, and on the front page of the literary supplement was a large picture of Krishnamoorthy, and in big, bold type, usually reserved for declaration of war, it said, "I am not an Indian." This caused quite a bit of consternation. In the book, I state that Krishnamoorthy said he was not an Indian and he was not a Hindu. Concurrent with the tour and the observances in India, the Foundation had launched a very large, ambitious exhibition in Vasanta Vihar that was there for several weeks. Then it traveled to Benares, then went down to Bangalore, and was exhibited to thousands of people. And it covered his whole life. The text for the biographical part of the exhibition was lifted directly from the book. In addition, at the end of the book, I devoted at least a dozen pages to a complete chronology of all the places where Krishnamurti spoke, beginning from his birth to the end of his life, but the public talks began in London in 1911 and go until 1986. The publisher at first didn't want to print this multiple-page supplement, But I insisted, and I said, this supplement illustrates the title of the book, because he gave thousands of talks over the period of his life, and here you have a record of every city he spoke in, every country he visited. I'll just read from a portion of the book. This is from chapter 1. The title of the chapter is Not an Indian. Where precisely is a biography to begin when the man being written about flatly denies any significance of his youth for his later life? Growing up in colonial India in the protective arms of a traditional Brahmanical extended family, 1895 to 1908, and then from his teen years in the International Theosophical Society, 1909 to 1929, and within the privileged classes of Edwardian England, 1911 to 1920, living through 86% of the 20th century, 1900 to 1986, the young Jiddu Krishnamoorthy said that the circumstances of his youth until about the age of 25 had no effect on him because he was not psychologically conditioned by where he lived and what his patrons and mentors taught him. This bold claim was borne out in his life because there was such a rich and deep dimension to his life and teachings worthy of volumes of information. I have chosen to intentionally keep this modest biography free of analysis and superfluous detail. Perhaps the reader will be prompted to go directly to Krishnamurti's teachings to further the exploration that this book initiates. The book has also come out this is the English edition in India, and it has come out in 7 Indian languages as well. The second book I'd like to talk about has just been sent to the printer and should be out in June next month. This book has taken me more than 25 years to compile. After studying Krishnamoorthy for more than 55 years, and after having a personal experience with him in this house in the 1970s of some dimension of the process, I felt for a long time that the so-called process was neglected, avoided, both in biographies and in other times and places where Krishnamurti could have gone into it. So I decided to collect eyewitness accounts of the process throughout Krishnamurti's life, beginning in 1922 and going to the end of his life, 1986. The title of the book is Krishnamurti's Process, Probing the Mystery. The cover shows the pepper tree here at Pine Cottage and the Nandi statue, which is at the front of Pine Cottage, which was installed as a gift to Krishnamoorthy in the late 70s. I felt that there were so many dimensions to the process. It was such a sensitive and very, for many years, very secretive aspect of his life, that I would have to do this very carefully, very sensitively, and not interpret, not explain, not analyze anything. I asked Alan Anderson, before he died, to write a preface for this book, and he wrote several pages. And from the preface, I'd like to read just a few lines that give a sense of the austerity that I used in the approach. This is from Alan Anderson. Some background will help unfold the inscrutability of the process. For J. Krishnamoorthy, the prophecy from ancient times and of the International Society of the emergence of a world teacher in the 20th century was an uncomfortable mantle. He had been educated and groomed for that role by patrons and teachers in India and Europe after having been discovered in 1910 and on a beach at the Bay of Bengal. My eyes are so bad that I have to look very carefully before I start reading. Excuse me for this delay. Here we are. In Krishnamoorthy's absolute negation of authority, there are fortunately sternly forbidding barriers against any authoritative interpretation of his legacy. This unquestionably blocks any apostolic succession or any academic claims to have mastery of his works. It would be pretentious to attempt a definitive, standard interpretation of Krishnamurti's teachings. This would include through the back door of his life story. Therefore, in writing this process book, I adopted a strict journalistic style and recorded only eyewitness accounts of the experiences as the only credible way to understand what the process could mean. So the book begins with a statement by his brother Nitya, and concludes at the end with a dialogue between Krishnamurti and David Bohm. There are so many of the passages that are so stark and deeply moving because of the extreme suffering and pain that Krishnamurti went through. They are, in fact, hard to read. Krishnamurti himself describes what happened, both in Pine Cottage and under the pepper tree. Fortunately, because of the extensive archives that the Foundation has, I was able to secure photographs of Krishnamurti under the pepper tree, sitting bolt upright, facing east. Another picture of him sleeping under the pepper tree. And several pictures of people who were present, who were again eyewitnesses to the whole process. Fortunately, one of the eyewitnesses, Mr. Warrington, wrote an account of what he observed, and that, along with Krishnamurti's own account and that of Nitya, form a very compelling and stark picture of what happened in 1922. In Krishnamurti's own words, "I came to myself at about noon each day. On that first day, while I was in that state and more conscious of the things around me, I had the first most extraordinary experience. There was a man mending the road. That man was myself. The pickaxe he held was myself. The very stone which he was breaking was part of me. The tender blade of grass was my very being, and the tree beside the man was myself. I almost could feel and think like the road mender, and I could feel the wind passing through the tree, and the little ant on the blade of grass I could feel. The birds, the dust, and the very noise were part of me. Just then, there was a car passing by at some distance. I was the driver, the engine, and the tires. As the car went further away from me, I was going away from myself. I was in everything, or rather, everything was in me. Inanimate and animate, the mountain, the worm, and all the breathing things. All day long I remained in this happy condition. I could not eat anything, and again at about 6, I began to lose my physical body. And naturally, the physical elemental did what it liked. I was semi-conscious. He went on, "I have drunk at the fountain of joy and eternal beauty. I am God intoxicated. The next day was spent under the tree in semi-consciousness, and that night I was the Lord Maitreya, again under the tree." This reads plainly and authoritatively with profound sanctity and sincerity. Krishnamurti's own description is full of the transcendental beauty of what was happening to his body and to his mind. And it raises many questions, raises in the reader. I have not attempted in the book to give any explanation, but Krishnamurti himself, in some of the later passages, does describe that some of the images were essentially theosophical and suggests some kind of a light or superficial conditioning from his own youth. As the years progressed from 22, 23, on into the 30s and the 40s, the nature of the process changed. Krishnamurti recorded some of these in his writings, and then in the 1960s, he began to keep a diary, a notebook, which was later published. In that notebook, he gives 91 references to a strange state of blessedness where what he called the other, or a benediction, descended on him. So this demonstrated that Krishnamurti was not trying to hide what was happening, but in conversations, in talks, in interviews, he rarely went into it. He was interviewed by Ram Landau in the 30s and said, when Landau asked him about the process, and he admitted, he said that he did not understand what he was going through. There are letters in the book from some theosophists, some of the major figures in the society, saying that they also did not understand what was happening to Kay. Then there is a very interesting diary in the book from a close personal friend in Rome, who records multiple instances of Kay's face changing, his whole physiognomy changing, going into an altered state of consciousness. This diary is in the book. It was provided to me by Mary Zimbalist. I could go on reading multiple examples, but I think that it needs to be, the instances, the experiences need to be taken as a whole. The end of the book has a very revealing dialogue between Krishnamoorthy and David Bohm, where Krishnamurti makes it very clear that the process has nothing to do with all of us, that students of the teachings, people interested in the teachings, did not have to go through any kind of a process at all. And he states this very categorically. David Bohm refers to the whole occurrences in his life as mysterious, and that it is most truly. It remains a mystery even after all these decades, even after reading all of the instances of the process. The mysteriousness of it cannot be alleviated. The last part of the book is a statement by Kay about how to approach a mystery. He was not talking about the process, but he was talking about what is mysterious in life, where the unknown is. I think that it's fairly clear that in the future, scholars, academics, people who are interested in the teachings will study the process as they study the teachings. the process does not explain or illuminate the teachings, but the reader, the student, is able to appreciate a very important dimension of Krishnamurti's private life. So I leave it at that the mystery remains, the mystery is still there, and I hope that the reader will hesitate, refrain from any kind of analysis or interpretation of what it all meant. So those are the two books that I wanted to talk about today. I hope you find them of interest and that they will add to the scholarship on Krishnamoorthy and his life and his teachings. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Are you open for some questions from us?
Quite open.
Oh, good, good. My first question actually, Johnny, I don't think you read the book, right? The World Teacher.
No, I am not.
Because Johnny is right in the age group, 20 and 30.
Right.
So I was wondering what his perspective would be on it. And it's also interesting that you, in this biography, and of course there are several biographies already. You have Mary Lutyens, you have, and this is maybe the first, well, it's an Indian biography, intended for Indian, but you put quite a significant amount about California in.
Right.
As is the book that's going to be discussed tomorrow by David Moody. So there seems to be somehow of a resurgence in putting the Krishnamurti of history, the history of Krishnamurti in California better on the map, as it was somehow not one of the pillars. The big pillar, Mary Lutyens did the English, the European history, more or less, and then what was her name? Pupul did then from an Indian perspective.
Right.
But there's not like a complete perspective from the American perspective, and now you have contributed to that more or less, right? Yeah. So why? What in your work? What was it? Why did they go to California? Why was that so relevant, or why was that so important?
Well, I'm not a scholar of theosophy, but from what I read, it seems they had theories about root races, where there are new civilizations that are born in the course of millennia, thousands and thousands of years. Each race has a different mentality. Each race has had different qualities, different depths. This, in some ways, coincided with the various the Kali Yuga, the theories and projections about the way humanity matures and develops over time. So they had determined that there would be a new root race, a sixth root race, that would be headquartered in the western part of the United States. And this would be a race of tall, very Aryan types, with a much more profound understanding of life. They would live in peace and harmony, and so on.
But did Krishnamurti know all that when he arrived? Because he was 27 in 1922. He arrived.
Right.
Was that his purpose? Why he came here?
No, he came in 22 on a tour. He was on a world tour. He had been in Australia with his brother, and he had given public talks in Australia very reluctantly. he wrote letters to his friends in Europe and said, "I'm not cut out for this." So he was doing what he was told to do. And that was, again, furthering this whole projection of him being spiritual royalty, and he was going to fulfill this mission. The brother became ill in Australia, and so it was decided to have him head further east and to go through the US and eventually get back to Europe and India for his health. So they arranged for him to travel by steamer from Sydney to San Francisco. The two of them. I think there were three. I think Warrington came with him. Krishnamurti was always very mindful of this mantle, this projection that he was to be the world teacher. He had not been to America before. When they arrived in San Francisco, he was immediately struck with the different culture, the different behavior of people, attitudes. He went on a tour of the Berkeley campus, USC, and was struck by the forthright, very direct, friendly, affectionate stares and looks of students. And he wrote about this in letters, that the American mind was different, the American culture was different. They hired a car and drove from San Francisco down the coast, and some person had provided them with a house in Ojai where they could stop the journey. And this was to be a new Station of the Cross. Ojai had already been designated as an important place. Theosophy had the center in Hollywood, and they were projecting to move some of it to Ojai. So when they came here, it was their very first trip, their very first time, and in both books I describe their first impressions of Ojai because it reminded them so much of India. They felt immediately very comfortable.
So one of the reasons was the health also of the boy,
of the brother.
Yeah, but did Krishnamurti ever comment on that whole the new culture, etc.? Did you find any references to that?
There is next to nothing.
Yeah.
On all of that. Krishnamurti spoke on a very different level. He didn't go into any of the organizational, any of the plans or projections for that. He spoke about truth. He spoke from the purity, the unassailable high position that he had for his whole life, and not about the organization. He rarely even talked about the masters or the world teacher as concepts. Later on, in the 30s, he began, after he had dissolved the Order of the Star, then there were many, many questions about all of this. And I've included the whole chapter on this in the process book.
I think we're going to have a break now for a few minutes. And then after the break we will come back with more questions. But I would also like to encourage people at home who are watching the stream, who have questions, just to write them down in the chat. And various of us are looking at that and selecting questions. Of course there are more questions than we can handle. But so bear with us. We're taking a few minutes break and then we're back here in Pine Cottage in Ojai, California. Thank you very much.
How many people are